The woman who would become known as Moses was born with a different name entirely. Araminta Ross came into the world around March of 1822 on Anthony Thompson's plantation at Peter's Neck in Dorchester County, Maryland, in a small cabin where her father lived. She would carry the nickname Minty through her childhood. She would survive an injury that should have killed her. She would change her name twice. And she would do something that terrified slaveholders across the South. She would return again and again to the place of her enslavement to bring others out. Not once, not twice, but approximately 13 times over the course of a decade, leading around 70 people to freedom while giving detailed instructions to 70 more who made the journey on their own. The plantation owners never figured out that the small, disabled woman they'd once owned was the one emptying their properties of human beings they claimed as property. They posted rewards. They held public meetings about the hemorrhaging of their enslaved population. But they never caught her, because Harriet Tubman understood something fundamental about the system she was fighting. Its operators underestimated the intelligence, capability, and determination of the people they enslaved. Araminta Ross was born into a world of fractured families and transferred ownership. Her mother, Harriet Ritt Green, was the property of Mary Pattison Brodess, who had inherited enslaved people from her grandfather, Atho Pattison. Her father, Benjamin Ben Ross, was one of 9 enslaved people owned by Anthony Thompson. When Mary Pattison Brodess, already widowed once, married Anthony Thompson in 1803, the two families' enslaved populations came together. Ritt and Ben married around 1808, and between that year and 1832, they had 9 children. Araminta was their 5th child, born after Lina, Mariah, Soph, and Robert, and before Benjamin, Rachel, Henry, and Moses. When Mary Brodess died in 1810, her son Edward was only 9 years old, so the family's property came under his stepfather Anthony Thompson's care until Edward came of age at 21. These transfers of ownership, these legal maneuvers that treated human beings as inheritable assets, would define the instability that characterized Araminta's entire childhood. The Brodess family didn't have enough work to keep all their enslaved people occupied on their own property, so Edward Brodess hired them out to other families. Araminta would later tell an interviewer that she seldom actually lived with the Brodesses. This meant constant separation from her mother and siblings. At age 6, in 1828, Brodess began renting her out to provide childcare for nearby families. The compensation for her work went to Brodess, and the time periods for these arrangements varied. One placement had her working as a nursemaid, staying awake all night to ensure an infant didn't cry and wake the owners. If she dozed off and the baby's crying disturbed the household, she was whipped. Years later, she could still show the scars on her neck where she'd been lashed as a small child for failing to dust properly, for letting that baby cry, for any infraction real or invented. She spoke of acute childhood homesickness, comparing herself to the boy on the Swanee River, referencing Stephen Foster's song about longing for home. She was a child laborer, separated from her family, worked by strangers, and beaten when she didn't perform to their satisfaction. The trauma accelerated as she got older. Brodess hired her to various neighboring farms for different kinds of work, checking muskrat traps in freezing water, field work, hauling logs. Her father, Ben Ross, was a highly valued timber inspector who supervised the vast timber operation on Thompson's land in the Peters Neck region, and eventually, in an unexpected development, Araminta was hired to work alongside him in the timber fields. This allowed her to spend time with her father after years of separation. but it also put her in contact with black sailors who worked the timber trade along the East Coast. These men were connected to networks of communication that stretched up and down the Atlantic seaboard. They shared their knowledge of the surrounding geography with her, and she learned about the networks of people working toward liberation. She learned the marshlands of Dorchester County intimately, understanding its waterways, its hiding places, its paths. She was developing skills that seemed unremarkable at the time, but would later prove essential. She was learning to read a landscape in darkness, to navigate by the stars, to understand who could be trusted. And then came the injury that should have ended her story before it truly began. Sometime in the mid-1830s, probably when she was around 13 years old, she was working for a neighboring farm. She and a cook from her employer's plantation went to a local store to purchase items. While they were there, an enslaved man from another plantation was discovered inside, having left without permission. His overseer pursued him to the store and found him there. The overseer demanded that Araminta help him restrain the man. She refused. The man fled, and in rage or desperation or both, the overseer picked up a 2-pound iron weight and hurled it at the fleeing man's head. His aim was off. The weight struck Araminta instead, hitting her so violently that, as she later described it, "It broke my skull and cut a piece of that shawl clean off and drove it into my head." She collapsed, bleeding and unconscious. Her owner had her returned to the Brodess property and simply laid her on the seat of a loom, where she remained for 2 days with no medical attention whatsoever. Her mother, Rit, nursed her as best she could with the limited resources available to enslaved people. She survived, but the injury left her with a condition that would plague her for the rest of her life. She experienced what we would now recognize as seizures or narcoleptic episodes, sudden spells where she would fall into a deep sleep without warning, sometimes in the middle of conversations or activities. She had crushing headaches and periods of dizziness. The injury also left her with something else: visions. She saw them as divine communications, as premonitions from God showing her glimpses of the future, warning her of danger, guiding her decisions. Whether these were temporal lobe seizures creating hallucinations or genuine spiritual experiences doesn't really matter in terms of understanding their impact on her life. She believed they were messages from God, and that belief gave her a confidence that allowed her to walk into situations that would have paralyzed others with fear. She described consulting with God, speaking directly to Him, trusting that He would keep her safe. Thomas Garrett, the Quaker abolitionist who would later work closely with her, said he never met any person of any color who had more confidence in the voice of God as spoken directly to their soul. Despite the injury, she continued working. She was assigned to field and forest work, driving oxen, plowing, hauling logs. The heavy labor developed her physical strength. She grew into a powerful woman despite her small stature, standing just over 5 feet tall. Her father's example shaped her understanding of resistance. When Ben Ross was around 45 years old, Anthony Thompson promised to free him at that age. After Thompson died, his son followed through with that promise in 1840, manumitting Ben Ross. Ben remained working as a timber estimator and foreman for the Thompson family, but now as a freed man. He also quietly became involved with the Underground Railroad, hiding and helping people who were escaping. This involvement would eventually become known to local slaveholders, putting him at risk. Around 1844, when she was about 22 years old, Araminta married John Tubman, a free black man who worked in the tobacco stick area of Dorchester County. She changed her name at that time, taking Harriet, possibly in honor of her mother, and adopting her husband's surname. The marriage was complicated by her enslaved status. Under Maryland law, a child's status followed the mother's condition, which meant that any children Harriet and John had together would be born into slavery. Such marriages between free and enslaved people were not uncommon on Maryland's eastern shore, where by this time about half the black population was free. Most African American families had both free and enslaved members. They may have been planning to purchase Harriet's freedom from boldest. She went so far as to pay a white attorney $5 to investigate the legal status of her mother. The lawyer discovered that Athau Pattison, Mary Brodess's grandfather, had stipulated in his will that Rit and any of her children would be manumitted at age 45, and that any children born after Rit reached that age would be freeborn. The Pattison and Brodess families had simply ignored this provision, but taking legal action to enforce the terms of a dead man's will against white slaveholders was an impossible task for an enslaved woman. She had witnessed 3 of her sisters sold away to distant plantations. Lina and Soph disappeared into the Deep South slave trade, never to be seen again. Her mother Rit had successfully resisted the sale of her youngest son Moses, hiding him for a month with the help of other enslaved people and free black neighbors. When the trader from Georgia and Brodess came to seize the child, Rit confronted them at the slave quarters, telling them that the first man who came into her house, she would split his head open. Brodess backed down and abandoned the sale. This story circulated within the family, demonstrating that resistance was possible, that slaveholders could be defied. Tubman absorbed these lessons, that family was worth fighting for, that direct confrontation could work, that slaveholders weren't invincible. In March 1849, Edward Brodess died. He was relatively young, and his death sent ripples of fear through the people he'd claimed as property. Everyone understood what an owner's death often meant: debts to settle, estates to divide, enslaved people to be sold. Young, healthy, enslaved people in their 20s could fetch more than $1,000 each to traders connected to the plantations of the Deep South. While other enslaved people at the Brodess property lamented this likely outcome, Harriet planned. She later recounted that she'd reasoned it out in her mind. There were 2 things she had a right to: liberty or death. If she couldn't have liberty, she would have death. On September 17, 1849, Harriet and her brothers Ben and Henry attempted an escape. They made it off the Poplar Neck plantation, but her brothers grew afraid of being caught and decided to turn back. She returned with them rather than abandon them, but she made plans to leave again. This time she would go alone. The Cambridge Democrat would later publish a notice offering $300 reward for the return of all 3 of them. But by the time it appeared, Harriet had already made it to Pennsylvania. The exact details of her route remain unclear, which was intentional. She used the North Star to navigate northward. A local white woman, possibly Hannah Leverton, or Hester Kelly from a Quaker family in Caroline County known to aid fugitives, provided assistance. Harriet traveled approximately 90 miles, moving at night, using the skills she'd developed working in the timber industry and learning the marshlands, until she crossed into Pennsylvania and stepped onto free soil. She later described that moment. She looked at her hands to see if she was the same person now that she was free. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and she felt like she was in heaven. But the euphoria was complicated by isolation. She was free, But she was a stranger in a strange land. There was no one to welcome her to the land of freedom. Her home, after all, was down in Maryland, because her father, her mother, her brothers, her sisters, her friends were there. She was free, but they should be free too. Almost immediately, she began planning to return. She made her way to Philadelphia, where she found work as a domestic servant and a cook. She worked diligently and saved nearly every penny she earned. She connected with the abolitionist community in the city, particularly with William Still, a free black man who worked as a clerk for the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society and served as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad wasn't an actual railroad with tracks and trains. It was a loose network of people, black and white, enslaved and free, who provided hiding places, food, directions, and assistance to people escaping slavery. The terminology used railroad language. Conductors guided people along the routes. Station masters provided safe houses. Passengers were the people making the journey toward freedom. Harriet absorbed everything William Still could teach her about how the network operated, about routes north, about which people could be trusted. She was preparing for something that most people who successfully escaped slavery never attempted. She was going to go back. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 changed the calculus for everyone involved in resistance. The new federal law made it illegal for any citizen to aid escaped slaves, and mandated that if an escaped slave was identified, they had to be apprehended and turned over to authorities for return to their rightful owner. Any U.S. Marshal who refused to comply faced a $1,000 fine. The act meant that reaching a free state wasn't enough. People had to continue north to Canada to be truly beyond the reach of slaveholders. The law was meant to discourage escape and assistance. Instead, it hardened the resolve of people like Harriet Tubman and made the Underground Railroad more essential than ever. In December 1850, Harriet learned that her niece Keziah Jolly and Keziah's two young children, James Alfred and Araminta, were going to be auctioned at the Cambridge, Maryland courthouse. Keziah was married to John Bowley, a free black man and a skilled boatman. Harriet traveled to Baltimore and coordinated with Bowley on a plan. At the auction, Bowley secretly placed the winning bid for his own wife and children. When Keziah was taken to the side of the stage after the bidding concluded, before the auctioneer could figure out what had happened, Bowley and Harriet spirited them away to a house near the courthouse. From there, Bowley sailed his family to Baltimore using his boat. Harriet hid them for several days before guiding them to Philadelphia. This was her first rescue mission. She would conduct 12 more. Between 1850 and 1860, Harriet Tubman made approximately 13 trips back into Maryland to bring people out of slavery. She personally guided around 70 people to freedom, and she provided detailed instructions to another 70 or so who found their way north independently. Her methods were meticulous. She typically traveled in winter when the nights were longest and people would be less likely to be out. She often started these journeys on Saturdays, because runaway notices wouldn't appear in newspapers until Monday, giving the group a head start. She used disguises, sometimes dressing as an old woman shuffling along. She used spirituals as coded messages, singing songs like "Go Down Moses," with changed lyrics to indicate whether it was safe to proceed or if danger was near. She relied on a network of black and white abolitionists, free black communities, and enslaved people who were part of the communication systems she'd learned about from those sailors back in Maryland. She carried a revolver. The gun served two purposes. First, it was protection against slave catchers and their dogs. But second, and perhaps more importantly, it was insurance against her passengers losing their nerve. She understood that if someone in the group decided to turn back, they risked not only themselves, but everyone who had helped them along the way. Under torture or threat, a person who returned could give up names, locations, routes. So when someone wavered, when exhaustion or fear made them say they were going back, Harriet would point that gun at their head and tell them, "Go on or die." Dead folks tell no tales. In every case, the person continued. Years later, one man who had wavered described crossing into Canada with the rest of the group several days after Harriet had put that gun to his head. She never lost a passenger. She never had her train run off the track. She was called Moses, and the nickname stuck because it was accurate. She was leading her people out of bondage. The slaveholders didn't know who was doing this. They held public meetings about the disturbing number of escapes in the area. They cast suspicion on free blacks and white abolitionists. But they didn't know that Minty, the small disabled woman who had run away years ago, was the one systematically emptying their properties. The myth of a $40,000 reward for her capture persists, but that figure was fabricated later by a supporter trying to emphasize the threat slaveholders perceived her to be. The actual reward offered was in an October 1849 advertisement by Eliza Brodess, offering $100 for each of the three who had fled: Minty, Ben, and Harry. That's not to say there weren't multiple rewards posted by different slaveholders for different escapes, but the massive unified bounty is legend rather than documented fact. Nevertheless, the fear was real. Slaveholders knew something was happening. They just couldn't catch whoever was making it happen. She brought out her brothers. She brought out her parents. Her rescue of her elderly parents in the summer of 1857 was prompted by urgent necessity. Ben Ross was warned that he would be arrested for suspicion of sheltering the Dover Eight, a group of 8 freedom seekers from Dorchester County. Ben had been manumitted, freed by his owner's will in 1840, and he'd purchased his wife Rit's freedom in 1855. But freedom for black people in Maryland was tenuous, subject to revocation, vulnerable to accusation. The threat of his arrest meant they had to leave immediately. Harriet, recognizing that her elderly parents couldn't walk the distance north, actually built a crude chariot from wheels and boards and had them ride in it. She brought them initially to Canada, to St. Catharines in Ontario, but the climate was too cold for the couple who were both around 70 years old. In 1859, she was able to purchase 7 acres of land with a house in Auburn, New York, from William H. Seward, who was at that time a U.S. Senator and a known supporter of the Underground Railroad. Seward had used his own house as a station many times. He sold Harriet the property for a modest sum, though technically the transaction was illegal because married women, particularly black women, had limited rights to own property. Harriet brought her parents to Auburn, where they would live for the rest of their lives. She tried to bring out her husband. She made a trip specifically to retrieve John Tubman, but he had remarried. He'd taken another wife, a free black woman, and he refused to leave. This must have stung. This discovery that the man she'd married had moved on, had made a new life. But she didn't return empty-handed from that trip. She guided another group to Canada instead. The decision to escape was always complicated, involving calculations about family, about children, about how to survive, about whether to trust the unknown. Not everyone was prepared to make that leap, even when the opportunity presented itself. Auburn became her base of operations, but she continued making trips south. Her last rescue mission was in 1860. She had planned to bring out her sister Rachel, But when she arrived in Maryland, she discovered that Rachel had died. Instead, she brought out the Ennals family, 7 people who were ready to go. By the end of 1860, Harriet Tubman had established herself as one of the most effective conductors on the Underground Railroad. She was well known within abolitionist circles, speaking at anti-slavery meetings and women's rights conventions in the late 1850s. She often used pseudonyms at these events, called Harriet Garrison or Harriet Tubman, to protect her identity from those who might try to capture her under the Fugitive Slave Act. But within the movement, her reputation was secure. She'd met Frederick Douglass, collaborated with him and others in the fight against slavery. She'd met John Brown, the radical abolitionist, in April 1858 in Canada. Brown was planning his raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, intending to spark a slave rebellion. He asked Harriet to help him recruit men and gather information about the landscape. She agreed, though she was ultimately not present when Brown carried out his raid in October 1859. Brown was captured and executed, but his raid demonstrated that armed resistance to slavery was not only possible, but was being actively pursued by white allies as well as black freedom fighters. When the Civil War began in April 1861, Harriet Tubman immediately understood its implications. She had a vision that the war would lead to the abolition of slavery. In early 1862, at the request of Massachusetts Governor John Andrew, she volunteered to support the Union cause. She traveled to Hilton Head, South Carolina, which had fallen to Union forces early in the war. Initially, she worked as a nurse, providing care for African American soldiers and civilians, but her skills ran deeper than nursing. She also ran a wash house and worked as a cook to earn money, because the Union Army wasn't paying her for her services. But what military officials quickly recognized was that she had something invaluable: the ability to gather information, to gain trust, to organize intelligence networks among the formerly enslaved population. She began recruiting local black men to work as scouts and spies. One of her recruits was William Plowden, an African-American man from Pennsylvania who enlisted in the U.S. colored troops. One night, Plowden and 8 other men sailed up the Combahee River and returned with detailed reports on bridges, trestle work, and the strength of Confederate military positions. Intelligence gathering like this was essential for Union operations in an unfamiliar landscape against an enemy that knew the terrain intimately. Harriet coordinated this network of informants, and she earned the trust of people who had every reason to be suspicious of armed forces in general. The intelligence she and her network gathered enabled one of the most remarkable military operations of the entire war. On the evening of June 1, 1863, 3 Union gunboats departed from Beaufort, South Carolina: the Sentinel, the John Adams, and the Harriet A. Weed. The ships carried approximately 300 soldiers from the 2nd South Carolina Volunteer Infantry, composed entirely of black troops who had been freed under the Emancipation Proclamation, along with a contingent from the 3rd Rhode Island Heavy Artillery to man the ship's guns. The 2nd South Carolina was commanded by Colonel James Montgomery, a fierce abolitionist who had fought pro-slavery settlers in Bleeding, Kansas before the war. Harriet Tubman was aboard the John Adams. One of the boats, the Sentinel, ran aground near Brickyard Point early in the journey, forcing the troops to transfer to the other vessels. The 2 remaining ships continued north. Around 2:30 in the morning on June 2nd, they arrived at the entrance to the Combahee River at Fields Point. Confederate soldiers fled at the sight of black Union troops. Montgomery left a company at Fields Point and proceeded up the river. The intelligence Harriet's network had provided told them where Confederate torpedoes, essentially water mines, had been planted in the river. The Union ships navigated around these obstacles. The intelligence also told them where enslaved people were being held on the plantations along the river, and word had been sent ahead that liberation was coming. As the gunboats moved up the Combahee River, steam whistles blowing, enslaved people began running from the surrounding plantations toward the sound of freedom. Harriet later described the scene with characteristic vividness. Women came with pails of rice still smoking from the fire balanced on their heads, babies hanging on their backs, children clutching their dresses, bags slung over shoulders containing pigs, sometimes carrying twins. One woman brought 2 pigs, a white one and a black one. The soldiers named them Beauregard and Jeff Davis after Confederate leaders. The scene was chaos and liberation combined. People came carrying everything they could grab, decades of suppressed hope suddenly finding expression in a desperate sprint to those boats. Union troops landed at various points along the river, destroying Confederate supplies and setting fire to wealthy plantations, including those owned by the Hayward, Middleton, and Lowndes families, all prominent secessionists. The raids destroyed millions of dollars worth of commissary stores, cotton, rice fields, and plantation infrastructure. But the primary objective was liberation. More than 750 enslaved people boarded those vessels and sailed to freedom. Many of the able-bodied men immediately enlisted in the Union Army, swelling the ranks of the U.S. colored troops. The Combahee River raid was a devastating blow to the Confederate economy and a profound boost to Union military strength. Harriet Tubman had planned and led this operation. She was the first woman in United States history to plan and lead a major military operation. A reporter for the Wisconsin State Journal who heard about the events wrote a story about the raid without a byline, describing how Montgomery's gallant band of 300 soldiers, under the guidance of a black woman, dashed into the enemy's country, struck a bold and effective blow, and brought off near 800 slaves. He called her She Moses, but didn't name her. That anonymity ended in July 1863 when Franklin Sanborn, editor of Boston's Commonwealth newspaper, picked up the story and named Harriet Tubman as the architect of the raid. Her fame increased, but compensation did not. Despite the mission's enormous success, Tubman was not paid for her services. After the Combahee raid, she continued working with Union forces in South Carolina. On June 3rd, the day after the raid, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment landed in Beaufort. This was the famous Regiment of Black, volunteers commanded by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. Harriet served meals to the men of the regiment, and she later claimed that she served Robert Gould Shaw his last breakfast on July 18, 1863, the day the 54th launched their heroic but doomed assault on Fort Wagner. After that battle, which resulted in devastating losses, Tubman helped bury the dead and aided survivors. She remained in the South for much of the war, working as a nurse, scout, and spy. The exact details of all her activities remain partially obscured because she was illiterate and because much of her work was necessarily secret. But records show she served with distinction, and after the war, she and her supporters spent decades trying to secure proper compensation and a pension from the federal government for her military service. The fight for her pension would be a long one, complicated by the chaos following Lincoln's assassination and by the general reluctance of the government to adequately compensate black veterans and support personnel. Initially, her applications lacked official documents. With help from supporters, she was able to appeal, but it took more than 30 years for her to receive proper recognition. In 1895, She was approved for a widow's pension of $8 a month after Nelson Davis's death. It wasn't until 1899 that Congress raised her pension to $20 per month, but even then, the increase was officially for her services as a nurse rather than acknowledgement of her military operations. Nelson Davis was the man she married on March 18, 1869, at the Central Presbyterian Church in Auburn. He was a black Union Army veteran who had served during the war. He'd been enslaved in North Carolina before joining the Union cause. After the war, he needed a place to stay and boarded in Harriet's home in Auburn for 3 years before they married. He was more than 20 years younger than Harriet, and he worked as a bricklayer when his health permitted. Davis suffered from tuberculosis, and his illness meant he couldn't hold steady employment, leaving Harriet as the primary provider for their household. Together, they adopted a baby girl they named Gertie. Their marriage lasted 20 years until Davis died in 1888, likely from his tuberculosis. The official cause of death was listed as tuberculosis of the lungs. Harriet's parents lived with her in Auburn. Her father, Ben, died around 1871. Her mother, Rit, lived until October 1880, reaching nearly 100 years of age. When Harriet had to travel for her Underground Railroad work or during her Civil War service, friends in Auburn looked after her parents. The community of abolitionists and reformers in Auburn provided a support network that allowed Harriet to continue her activist work even while maintaining family responsibilities. Auburn itself was crucial to this. The city was a hotbed of abolitionist and progressive thought, home to activists who supported not just the end of slavery, but also women's, suffrage, and other reform movements. Harriet had been connected to women's rights activists since her Underground Railroad days. Many of the people who funded her trips and provided safe houses were also involved in the women's suffrage movement. Frances Seward, William Seward's wife, was an abolitionist and suffragist. Martha Coffin Wright and her sister Lucretia Mott, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Susan B. Anthony. All of these women were part of overlapping networks of reform. Harriet attended women's suffrage meetings even while she was conducting rescue missions in the 1850s. After the Civil War, as her health and advancing age made extensive travel more difficult, she became more actively involved in the suffrage movement. In the 1890s, her participation increased. In July 1896, she spoke at the founding conference of the National Association of Colored Women. In November 1896, Susan B. Anthony introduced her at a suffrage convention in Rochester, New York. Anthony inscribed a copy of Harriet's biography to commemorate one visit. This most wonderful woman, Harriet Tubman, is still alive. I saw her but the other day at the beautiful home of Eliza Wright Osborne. Anthony listed all the prominent suffragists who had gathered to see Harriet, describing it as a real love feast of the few that are left, and here came Harriet Tubman. The suffrage movement had its own complications regarding race. Some white suffragists made racist arguments about why educated white women should vote before illiterate black men. But Harriet's presence at these conventions and her work with women like Anthony represented the strand of the movement that understood the interconnected nature of freedom struggles. But her primary work in her later years was caring for her community in Auburn. She used proceeds from her autobiographies, Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman, published in 1869, and an expanded edition titled Harriet, the Moses of Her People, published in 1886, to support her property and the people she cared for. She operated essentially a boarding house for elderly and sick black people who had nowhere else to go. In 1896, She purchased 25 acres of land adjacent to her property at an auction for $1,450. She had a vision for this land. She wanted to establish a proper home for aged and indigent black people. Getting the funding for such an endeavor proved difficult, so in 1903, unable to make the tax payments on the property, she deeded it to the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, with the understanding that they would establish and operate the home. The Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged opened on June 23, 1908. It was the only charity outside New York City dedicated specifically to the shelter and care of African Americans in the entire state. Harriet attended the opening ceremony, but by that time, her own health was failing. She had struggled with pain from her childhood head injury her entire life. In the late and 1890s, she underwent brain surgery at Massachusetts General Hospital in an attempt to alleviate her painful headaches. The surgery provided some relief, but couldn't eliminate the underlying issues. By 1911, she was too frail to care for herself. She became a resident of the home she had founded, cared for in the institution she had worked so hard to create. She died there of pneumonia on March 10, 1913, surrounded by friends and family. She was somewhere between 90 and 91 years old, though her exact age remained uncertain since records of enslaved people's births were rarely kept. Her last words were, "I go to prepare a place for you." Her funeral was held at the Thompson AME Zion Church in Auburn, the same church that had taken over operation of her home. She was buried with military honors at Fort Hill Cemetery in Auburn. Soldiers honored her service. The community she had served mourned her passing. A year after her death, Auburn held a one-day memorial, and residents unveiled a plaque in her honor at the entrance to the Cayuga County Courthouse, where it remains today. The question that hangs over Harriet Tubman's legacy is not whether she was heroic. That much is undeniable. The question is how we understand the particular form her resistance took, and what it reveals about the possibilities available to people living under brutal systems of oppression. Tubman didn't organize mass uprisings. She didn't lead armies in the conventional sense until the Combahee Raid. She didn't write treatises or make speeches to large crowds. What she did was return, repeatedly, at enormous personal risk, to lead small groups of people through darkness to freedom. She did it 13 times. She never lost anyone. She demonstrated that the system had vulnerabilities, that people claimed as property had agency, that escape was possible with courage, planning, and help from others. The slaveholders who posted those rewards, who held those worried meetings about the hemorrhaging of their enslaved populations, never figured out that the conductor emptying their plantations was a woman they'd once owned, a woman they'd nearly killed with a thrown weight, a woman they'd dismissed as damaged property. Their fundamental error was viewing enslaved people as lesser, as incapable of the intelligence and determination that Tubman embodied. She exploited that blindness. She used it against them. Every person she guided north was proof that the system's foundation, its claim that black people were property rather than human beings with agency and rights, was a lie that could be exposed one escape at a time. Her work on the Underground Railroad represented resistance through repeated action, through commitment that lasted a decade, through personal courage applied not just once but over and over. She didn't wait for others to free her family. She went back and got them herself. She didn't leave her community behind when she reached safety. She made herself more vulnerable by returning, but she did it anyway because freedom meant little if it only applied to her. This understanding, that liberation is collective rather than individual, animated everything she did. She wasn't content to be free alone. She wanted her people free, and she was willing to risk everything to make it happen. During the Civil War, her intelligence work and her planning of the Combahee raid represented another form of resistance, using institutional power, in this case the Union Army, to achieve liberation on a larger scale. 750 people freed in a single operation, millions of dollars in Confederate infrastructure destroyed, a demonstration to enslaved people throughout South Carolina that the Union forces were serious about liberation. These weren't symbolic gestures. They were practical actions with immediate, tangible results. And they were led by a black woman who understood the landscape, who knew how to gather information, who could inspire trust in people who had every reason to be suspicious of armed forces. Her later activism, her suffrage work, her establishment of the Home for the Aged, these represented yet another approach to resistance, building institutions, advocating for rights, caring for community members who were vulnerable. She understood that freedom wasn't just the absence of legal slavery. It required economic security, political power, community support. She spent decades fighting for a pension she'd earned through military service. She had to beg the government to acknowledge her contributions, and when she finally got a modest pension, she used it not for personal comfort, but to support her work caring for others. She lived in what was essentially genteel poverty for most of her later life, always taking in people who needed help, always working for causes larger than herself. There's a tendency to sanctify historical figures, to make them so heroic that they become superhuman, and therefore irrelevant as models for action. Harriet Tubman was not superhuman. She was a woman who suffered from a severe disability that caused unpredictable seizures. She struggled financially her entire life. She worked constantly, whether it was physical labor as an enslaved person, the dangerous work of conducting on the Underground Railroad, nursing and spying during the war, or caring for others in her later years. She never had the security or comfort that her contributions should have earned her. The government she served took decades to provide even minimal compensation. She died in the charity home she'd founded because she needed care herself. What made her remarkable wasn't supernatural ability. It was moral clarity combined with practical capability. She saw the situation clearly. Slavery was evil. Freedom was worth any risk. People deserved dignity and rights regardless of their race or gender. And she had the skills and determination to act on that clarity. She could navigate by the stars. She knew the landscape. She could read people and situations. She could plan operations and execute them successfully. She could make hard decisions like pointing that gun at someone's head and saying, "Go on or die," because she understood that sentimentality could get everyone killed. These were practical skills applied to moral purposes. The mythology that's built up around her, the stories of her being an Ashanti sorceress who could turn into a leopard, the exaggerated bounties, the inflated numbers of people rescued, all of this actually obscures what's most impressive about her. She didn't need to rescue 300 people to be extraordinary. 70 is extraordinary. 13 trips back into slave territory is extraordinary. Never losing a passenger is extraordinary. Planning and leading the Combahee raid is extraordinary. Working until her 90s to care for her community is extraordinary. The documented facts of her life are more than sufficient to establish her significance without embellishment. What's worth examining is what her story reveals about resistance under oppression. It shows that resistance takes many forms, from individual escapes to organized networks to military operations to political activism to community building. It shows that the most effective resistance often comes from those who are most oppressed because they have the greatest motivation and the deepest understanding of how the system actually works. It shows that allies matter, that the white Quakers who provided safe houses, the black sailors who shared knowledge, the abolitionists who provided funding, all of these people made Tubman's work possible. Resistance is collective even when it has individual heroes. It also shows the costs of resistance. Tubman lived with pain from that head injury for her entire life. She lived in poverty despite being famous within reform circles. She never received adequate compensation for her military service. She outlived most of the people she'd worked closely with. Her husband from her first marriage didn't even wait for her to attempt a rescue, remarrying while she was still in slavery. The work of liberation exacted a heavy toll on those who committed to it most fully. This isn't to glorify suffering, but to recognize that meaningful resistance usually requires sacrifice, and those sacrifices often go uncompensated. Her story also reveals the particular ways that black women's resistance was devalued and ignored by the structures they were fighting against and sometimes even by their allies. The government took more than 30 years to provide her with a proper pension, and even then framed it as compensation for nursing, rather than for military operations and intelligence work. The suffrage movement she supported contained strands of racism that excluded or marginalized black women. The historical record itself initially underestimated her role, with early accounts inflating numbers or focusing on male abolitionists, while relegating her to the supporting cast. Only more recent historical work has properly centered her role and importance. Recognition came, but it came slowly and often posthumously. The plaque at the courthouse in Auburn was dedicated in 1914, a year after her death. The Home for the Aged continued operating for a few years and then closed, sitting vacant from 1928 until the city ordered it demolished in 1944. The AME Zion Church raised $30,000 to restore it, and the restored home was dedicated in 1953 as a memorial to Tubman. Her birthplace in Maryland remained unmarked for decades. The Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historical Park wasn't established until 2013, exactly 100 years after her death. In 2016, the Treasury Department announced plans to put her image on the $20 bill, though implementation of that change has been delayed. In November 2024, she was posthumously recognized by the governor of Maryland as a one-star brigadier general, 2 years after the research was completed for this script. What does it mean to honor Harriet Tubman's legacy today? It means first understanding what she actually did, separating documented history from mythology. It means recognizing that her work was part of larger collective struggles, not the actions of a lone hero. It means acknowledging the costs she paid and the compensation she never received. It means asking what resistance looks like in our own time, what systems of oppression still need to be confronted, who is doing the unglamorous, dangerous work of building alternatives. It means recognizing that liberation is never won once and for all, that it requires repeated action, sustained commitment, practical skills applied to moral purposes. Harriet Tubman spent approximately 90 years on this earth. For the first 27 years, she was legally classified as property, subjected to violence, exploitation, and the constant threat of being sold away from her family. For the remaining 63 years, she worked toward freedom. Freedom for herself, freedom for her family, freedom for others, economic freedom, political freedom, the freedom to live with dignity and security. She never stopped working toward that goal. Even in her 90s, living in the home for the aged she'd founded, she represented a lifetime of commitment to the liberation struggle. When she died in 1913, slavery had been legally abolished for 48 years, but full freedom for Black Americans remained an unfulfilled promise. It still does. That's not a failure of her work. It's a recognition of how entrenched these systems are, how much work remains, how many more Harriet Tubmans the work requires. She showed it was possible. She showed what dedication looks like, what courage can accomplish, what love for one's people motivates. The rest is up to those who come after.